$40 million. That's what the U.S. government poured into a war that lasted 7 grueling years, a sum that translates to over $1.5 billion in today's money. This wasn't just a fight for land. It was a saga of broken treaties and profound injustice. The conflict saw a celebrated Seminole chief, Osceola, betrayed under a peace flag, only for his head to be grotesquely displayed in a pharmacy after his death in captivity. This is the story of one of America's longest and most costly Indian wars. To understand the ferocious conflict that became the Second Seminole War, one must first examine the deep and complex history of the Florida Peninsula. The roots of this bloody chapter were sown centuries before the first shots were fired, in the interplay of empires, migrations, and the forging of a unique people. The human story in Florida stretches back approximately 14,000 years to the era of Paleo-Indians. During the last ice age, lower sea levels meant the Florida Peninsula was significantly larger than its present-day configuration. By the time Juan Ponce de Leon made landfall in 1513, an estimated 200,000 indigenous people inhabited the peninsula. Their world underwent a cataclysmic shift with the arrival of Europeans. In 1539, Hernando de Soto's expedition cut a swath of destruction through the interior. His forces plundered native food stores, impressed women into sexual slavery, and perpetrated massacres. Compounding this violence, diseases introduced by the Spanish, to which the native populations had no immunity, decimated their numbers. The French also staked a claim, arriving in Florida in 1562. However, Spanish dominion was solidified with the founding of St. Augustine in 1565, which stands today as the oldest continuously inhabited European established settlement in North America. Spain's colonial efforts concentrated around North Florida, where they established a network of forts and missions. This first period of Spanish control ended following the 7 Years' War, with Great Britain assuming control of Florida. The British encouraged the development of plantations and expanded road networks, but their tenure was brief. Following the American Revolutionary War, Florida reverted to Spanish rule. It was during this second Spanish period that the Seminole identity began to coalesce. Spanish Florida became a refuge. Enslaved Africans escaping plantations in the American South sought freedom within its borders. Simultaneously, remnants of various southeastern indigenous tribes, displaced by American expansion and internal conflicts, also migrated south into Florida. These disparate groups of Native Americans, primarily Creeks, but also Yamasees, Uchis, and others, along with the self-emancipated Africans often called Black Seminoles or Maroons, began to intermingle. They established new towns, shared agricultural practices, and developed a distinct syncretic culture. The term Seminole, derived from the Creek word Seminole, meaning runaway or wild one, came to encompass these diverse peoples who resisted assimilation into either European or American society. A significant flashpoint emerged near the Apalachicola River during the War of 1812. The British, seeking to destabilize the American southern frontier, constructed a fort and supplied local Native Americans and a growing number of freedom-seeking former slaves with arms. After the war, the British departed, leaving the well-stocked fort, which became known to Americans as the Negro Fort, in the hands of its black and Native occupants. The existence of this fortified community of armed, free black people so close to the U.S. border was intolerable to American slaveholders and military authorities. In 1816, under orders, Colonel Duncan Lamont Clinch advanced American forces to construct Fort Scott just north of the Florida border. On the 18th of July 16, U.S. troops, supported by Allied Lower Creek warriors, ascended the Apalachicola River. Their target, the Negro Fort. During the ensuing bombardment, a heated cannonball, a hot shot, fired from an American gunboat, penetrated the fort's powder magazine. The resulting explosion was immense, reportedly heard as far away as Pensacola, over 100 miles distant. Of the approximately 320 men, women, and children inside the fort, around 250 were killed instantly. Many more succumbed to their injuries shortly thereafter. The destruction of the Negro fort did not pacify the region. Retaliation followed. In 1817, a U.S. Tame supply boat on the Apalachicola River, carrying soldiers, as well as women and children, was ambushed. All but 6 of its occupants were killed, their bodies left as a testament to the escalating violence. The recurring cross-border raids, the sanctuary Florida offered to escaped slaves, and the unresolved tensions following the attack on the Negro fort prompted more direct U.S. military intervention. General Andrew Jackson, a figure renowned for his aggressive stance towards Native American tribes and his actions in the Creek War, was tasked with leading a military expedition into Spanish Florida. This initiated what became known as the First Seminole War. Jackson, at the head of a force composed of U.S. Army regulars, Tennessee volunteers, Georgia militia, and Allied Creek warriors, crossed into Florida in early 1818. His orders were to pursue hostile Seminoles and protect American settlements, but Jackson interpreted them broadly. His campaign was swift and largely one-sided. Jackson's forces targeted Seminole and Maroon towns, burning villages, destroying crops, and capturing livestock. He controversially seized the Spanish post of St. Mark's, where he captured 2 British subjects, Alexander Arbuthnot and Robert Ambrister, whom he accused of inciting the Seminoles and Maroons against the United States. After a summary court-martial, both were executed, an act that caused an international incident with Great Britain. Jackson then moved on Pensacola, the capital of Spanish West Florida, occupying it with little resistance. The military operations effectively concluded by May 1818. Jackson's unauthorized invasion of Spanish territory created a significant political dilemma for President James Monroe's administration. While Jackson's actions were popular with many Americans who favored expansion, they violated international law and strained relations with Spain and Great Britain. Negotiations with Spain for the purchase of Florida, which had been ongoing, were temporarily derailed. However, Spain, weakened by Napoleonic wars and revolutions in its Latin American colonies, lacked the military capacity in Florida to effectively challenge the United States or prevent further incursions. Recognizing its tenuous hold on the territory and facing American pressure, Spain ultimately chose to cede Florida. In 1819, the Adams-Onís Treaty was signed, by which Spain relinquished all claims to East and West Florida to the United States, in exchange for the U.S. assuming $5 million in claims by American citizens against Spain and agreeing to a more defined boundary between U.S. territory and Spanish Texas. The United States formally took possession of Florida in 1821, marking a new chapter in the region's history and for the Seminole people who called it home. With Florida, now an American territory, pressure mounted to open its lands for white settlement and to resolve the Seminole question. In 1823, U.S. officials negotiated the Treaty of Moultrie Creek with a number of Seminole leaders. Under its terms, the Seminoles agreed to relinquish their claims to vast tracts of land in North Florida and the fertile coastal areas, and to confine themselves to a reservation of approximately 4 million acres in the interior of central Florida. In return, the U.S. government was to provide agricultural implements, livestock, an annuity of $5,000 for 20 years, and protection against encroachment by white settlers. The years following the treaty saw a steady influx of American settlers into Florida. The territorial government and military established infrastructure to support this expansion and to monitor the Seminole Reservation. Forts were constructed along the reservation's periphery, and roads were cut through the wilderness. Fort King, located near present-day Ocala, was established at the edge of the reservation, and an Indian agency was set up nearby to oversee relations with the Seminoles. Despite the treaty's provisions, friction persisted and intensified. The reservation lands were generally less fertile than those the Seminoles had ceded, making agriculture difficult. Hunting, a crucial means of subsistence, was restricted by the reservation's boundaries. Some Seminoles, driven by necessity, ventured outside the designated area to hunt, which alarmed white settlers who feared attacks. More significantly, the issue of fugitive slaves remained a potent source of conflict. Florida had long been a haven, and enslaved people continued to seek refuge among the Seminoles, who often integrated them into their communities. Slave catchers, sometimes operating with official sanction, entered the reservation attempting to reclaim fugitives. These incursions were deeply resented by the Seminoles, who often resisted. Tensions escalated when slave catchers began seizing not only escaped slaves, but also black Seminoles, who had been born free within the tribe or were descendants of those who had lived freely among them for generations. The U.S. government, moreover, often failed to uphold its treaty obligations, including providing the promised protection against settler encroachment and delivering annuities in full and on time. The political climate shifted decisively with the election of Andrew Jackson as president in 1828 and his subsequent signing of the Indian Removal Act in 1830. This act authorized the president to negotiate with southern Native American tribes for their removal to federal territory west of the Mississippi River in exchange for their ancestral lands. While ostensibly voluntary, the act provided the framework for the forced displacement of thousands of Native Americans. For the Seminoles in Florida, the implications were ominous. The government's desire to extinguish all Native American land titles east of the Mississippi and to prevent Florida from serving as a refuge for escaped slaves converged, setting the stage for further demands and, ultimately, renewed war. The United States government, under President Andrew Jackson, intensified its efforts to remove the Seminole people from Florida. In May 1832, Seminole leaders were summoned to a council at Payne's Landing on the Ocklawaha River. The objective of the American commissioners, led by James Gadsden, was unequivocal: to persuade the Seminoles to sign a treaty relinquishing their Florida lands and agree to relocate west of the Mississippi River, to territory designated for other southeastern tribes, what is now Oklahoma. The proposed treaty stipulated that a delegation of Seminole chiefs would first travel to inspect the new lands. If this delegation found the lands acceptable, the treaty would become binding. Several chiefs, including Jumper, Charlie Amathla, and Holate Amathla, along with the influential black Seminole interpreter Abraham, formed the delegation that traveled west in late 1832 and early 1833. Upon their return, and under circumstances that remain contentious, some members of the delegation signed an additional document at Fort Gibson, in present-day Oklahoma, in the 18th of March 33, affirming the suitability of the western lands. Many Seminole leaders later vehemently disputed the legitimacy of this affirmation and the original Treaty of Payne's Landing itself, claiming they had been coerced, deceived about its terms, or that their signatures were forged. Some asserted they had only agreed to consider removal, not to definitively commit to it. A significant faction of Seminoles, including prominent figures like Micanopy, the principal chief, and younger, more militant leaders such as Osceola, remained steadfastly opposed to leaving Florida. Nevertheless, a smaller group, seeing the futility of resistance, or perhaps swayed by government promises, indicated a willingness to emigrate. The U.S. Senate ratified the Treaty of Payne's Landing in the 18th of April 34. The treaty stipulated that the Seminoles had 3 years from the date of the initial agreement, May 1832, to relocate. With the ratification, this effectively left them with only about 1 year, setting a deadline for early 1835. To enforce the treaty, Fort King was reactivated. and a new, determined Seminole agent, Wiley Thompson, arrived in late 1834. Thompson promptly convened councils with the Seminole leadership. The chiefs reiterated their position. Florida was their home, and they did not wish to move west. They pointed to the unsuitability of the western lands, the potential for conflict with other tribes already there, and their inherent right to their Florida homeland. Thompson, receiving reports that Seminoles were acquiring powder and lead, communicated to Washington his assessment that military force would likely be necessary and requested reinforcements. In early 1835, Thompson again assembled the chiefs. He read aloud a letter from President Jackson, which left no room for negotiation. The Seminoles would move west, peacefully or by force. An uneasy silence followed. After a month of deliberation, the majority of chiefs formally informed Thompson they would not relocate. Tensions ran high. A heated exchange occurred, during which Osceola reportedly plunged his knife into the treaty document, declaring, "This is the only treaty I will make with the whites." While this specific act is debated by historians, his defiance was palpable. Eventually, under immense pressure, some chiefs appeared to acquiesce, agreeing to removal if granted an extension of 1 year to prepare. However, a substantial and defiant portion of the Seminole population, inspired by leaders like Osceola, Arpaca, Sam Jones, and Alligator, remained resolved to resist. In response to the growing intransigence, Wiley Thompson implemented a ban on the sale of firearms and ammunition to the Seminoles. This act particularly incensed Osceola, a rising and charismatic warrior who recognized that disarmament would cripple any potential resistance. Thompson, in a seemingly contradictory move, had earlier attempted to cultivate a personal relationship with Osceola, even presenting him with a new American rifle as a gift. But as Osceola's opposition became more overt, the agent's stance hardened. In the 18th of June 35, Thompson had Osceola briefly imprisoned at Fort King, reportedly placing him in irons, until the warrior agreed, under duress, to abide by the treaty and encourage his followers to do the same. Osceola's compliance was feigned. During the summer of 1835, while a few hundred Seminoles were gathered at forts and began the westward journey, the core of the resistance solidified. A Seminole council, dominated by anti-removal factions, decreed a sentence of death upon any chief who sold their property or began preparations for emigration. This decree was soon put into effect. In the autumn of 1835, Chief Charlie Amathla, one of the leaders who had decided that emigration was the only viable path and had agreed to sell his cattle at Fort King in preparation for departure, was ambushed on his way back to his village. Osceola led the party that carried out the execution. After Amathla was shot down, Osceola took the money Amathla had received from the cattle sale and scattered the silver coins over his body, a clear and brutal message to any others considering compliance. American military presence in Florida was increasing as Washington anticipated trouble. Sporadic attacks on plantations and settler wagon trains, along with minor skirmishes, signaled that the Seminoles would not be moved without a fight. The 28th of December 1835 marked the irrevocable descent into open warfare. At Fort Brooke, near Tampa Bay, Major Francis Langhorne Dade received orders to lead his command of 2 companies, comprising 8 officers and 102 enlisted men from the 2nd Artillery, 3rd Artillery, and 2nd Infantry Regiments to reinforce the garrison at Fort King, a distance of roughly 100 miles to the north. The column, equipped with a 6-pounder field gun drawn by oxen, departed Fort Brooke on the 23rd of December. Seminole scouts, led by warriors Jumper, Micanopy, and Alligator, shadowed Dade's column from the moment it left the relative safety of Fort Brooke. They watched its slow progress, planning their moment to strike. After 5 days of arduous marching through difficult terrain, Dade's men, many of whom were recent recruits, believed they were past the most dangerous part of their journey. On the morning of the 28th of December, a cold rain fell, the temperature hovering around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Major Dade, concerned about keeping their flintlock muskets operational, instructed his men to keep their weapons protected under their greatcoats to ensure the black powder in the pans remained dry. As the column approached the area near the present-day town of Bushnell, approximately 25 miles south of Fort King, the narrow military road passed through a stretch of open pine forest, interspersed with dense palmetto scrub and ponds. Hidden within this cover, an estimated 180 Seminole warriors lay in ambush, perfectly positioned on the west side of the road. They held their fire until Major Dade and the advance guard were directly abreast of their main position. At approximately 8 a.m., a single shot, purportedly fired by Chief Micanopy himself, signaled the attack. A devastating volley erupted from the concealed Seminoles. More than half of Dade's command, including Major Dade, who was struck by the first or second shot, fell in this initial fusillade. The disciplined fire of the Seminoles, armed primarily with trade muskets and rifles, wrought havoc on the surprised and exposed soldiers. The surviving officers, Captain Upton S. Frazier and Captain George W. Gardner, attempted to rally the men. Those still on their feet scrambled for cover and began to return fire. Using felled trees, they hastily constructed a small, triangular breastwork of logs. The 6-pounder cannon was brought into action, its blasts of canister shot temporarily, forcing the Seminoles to pull back further into the woods. The engagement continued for several hours. The Seminoles, masters of woodland fighting, used the terrain to their advantage, picking off the American soldiers from behind trees and palmetto thickets. The soldiers inside the flimsy breastwork fought with desperation, but their numbers dwindled. Ammunition for the cannon was eventually exhausted. By early afternoon, around 2 p.m., after nearly 5 hours of intermittent but relentless combat, the Seminole warriors perceived that resistance had weakened significantly. They launched a final assault, overrunning the crude fortification. They found no soldier left capable of offering resistance. The Seminoles collected the soldiers' muskets, ammunition, and provisions before melting back into the wilderness. Only 3 soldiers from Dade's command ultimately survived the journey to Fort King. Private Ransom Clark, wounded 5 times, feigned death and later crawled away, eventually meeting up with Private John Thomas and Private Joseph Sprague, who had also managed to escape. Louis Pacheco, an enslaved man who served as Dade's interpreter and guide, was captured by the Seminoles. He was later released by them but was subsequently rearrested by American forces who suspected him of collusion in the ambush. Pacheco was returned to slavery and remained enslaved until the end of the Civil War. On the very same day, the 28th of December, 1835, another deadly blow was struck against the American presence. Wiley Thompson, the Seminole agent, and Lieutenant Constantine Smith of the 2nd Artillery were taking an afternoon stroll outside the stockade walls of Fort King. They were unarmed and apparently unconcerned, despite the palpable tension in the region. Osceola, along with approximately 60 warriors who had been observing the fort for 2 days, seized the opportunity. They burst from cover, firing a volley. Thompson was hit multiple times, reportedly by Osceola himself, some accounts claiming Osceola used the very rifle Thompson had once given him as a gift. Both Thompson and Smith were killed. Osceola's warriors then scalped Thompson. These coordinated attacks, the Dade Massacre and the killing of Agent Thompson, effectively signaled the full-scale commencement of the Second Seminole War. The isolated attack and burning of the Bowlegs family's plantation on the St. Johns River by a Seminole war party on the 23rd of January, 1836, further confirmed that Florida was now a widespread theater of war. Following the initial devastating blows dealt to U.S. forces and personnel, in late the 18th of December 35, large groups of Seminole warriors, often accompanied by their families, withdrew into the complex and challenging terrain of Florida's interior. One significant area of concentration was the Wahoo Swamp, a dense network of wetlands and hammocks located near the Withlacoochee River. These natural redoubts offered the Seminoles considerable defensive advantages and bases from which to operate. In 1836, Territorial Governor Richard Keith Call, who also held the rank of general in the militia, was tasked with a major offensive. His objective was to locate and destroy Seminole villages and strongholds along the Withlacoochee River, thereby crippling their ability to sustain the fight. On the 21st of November, 1836, this campaign culminated in the Battle of Wahoo Swamp. General Call commanded a substantial force of approximately 2,500 men, comprising U.S. Army regulars, Florida militia, and a contingent of allied Creek warriors, many of whom had been traditional enemies of the Seminoles. They confronted an estimated 600 Seminole warriors, skillfully positioned to defend the approaches to their swamp encampments. The battle was fierce. American forces advanced, attempting to dislodge the Seminoles from their well-chosen positions. Despite the numerical superiority of Call's army, the Seminoles offered determined resistance. Eventually, under sustained pressure, the Seminole fighters were compelled to fall back deeper into the swamp, taking advantage of the difficult terrain to evade decisive engagement. While a tactical victory for the U.S. forces in that they pushed the Seminoles back, Wahoo Swamp was not the conclusive blow Call had hoped for. It was, up to that point, the largest single engagement of the war. American casualties numbered 12 killed and 34 wounded. The exact number of Seminole casualties remains uncertain, as they customarily retrieved their dead and wounded from the field when possible, but estimates suggest between 35 and 75 Seminole warriors perished in the fighting. The Battle of Wahoo Swamp underscored the Seminoles' effective use of their environment and their mastery of irregular warfare. Throughout the early years of the conflict, they consistently avoided large-scale, pitched battles where American numbers and firepower would prevail. Instead, they employed classic guerrilla tactics. Small, mobile war parties launched swift surprise attacks on isolated military outposts, vulnerable plantations, and supply wagon trains. They ambushed patrols and sniped at American soldiers, melting back into the swamps and hammocks before substantial U.S. forces could counterattack. This strategy aimed to inflict steady casualties, disrupt American logistics and morale, and make the cost of subduing Florida prohibitive. The inability of conventional military tactics to quell Seminole resistance led to a change in American strategy and command. In the 18th of December 36, Major General Thomas Sidney Jessup assumed command of U.S. forces in Florida. Jessup arrived with significant reinforcements, eventually commanding an army that swelled to over 9,000 troops, including regulars, Marines, Navy personnel, and militia. He recognized that chasing elusive Seminole bands through the swamps was largely futile. Instead, Jessup implemented a more comprehensive and attritional approach. He divided his forces into smaller, more mobile columns to conduct relentless search and destroy missions, systematically scouring the countryside for Seminole encampments, farms, and caches of food. Simultaneously, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps instituted patrols along Florida's rivers, coasts, and inlets, aiming to intercept Seminole supplies and communications and to prevent their movement. Jessup's overarching goal was to grind down the Seminoles' will and capacity to fight by destroying their subsistence base and maintaining constant military pressure. This intensified campaign began to yield results, albeit slowly and at great cost. Numerous small bands of Seminoles were captured or killed. Starvation and relentless pursuit compelled some chiefs to surrender with their followers, who were then typically disarmed and deported to the West. However, key leaders, most notably Osceola and Arpeka, Sam Jones, remained defiant, embodying the spirit of resistance and continuing to rally warriors to defend their homeland. On the 2nd of June, 1837, These two leaders, with a force of warriors, executed a daring raid on a U.S. Army detention camp at Fort Brooke, liberating approximately 700 Seminoles who were being held there pending removal. Frustrated by the protracted nature of the war and the resilience of leaders like Osceola, General Jessup resorted to controversial methods. In the 18th of October, 37, Brigadier General Joseph Hernandez, commanding Florida militia under Jessup's orders, arranged a meeting with Osceola and other chiefs near St. Augustine. The Seminoles approached under a white flag of truce, believing they were coming to negotiate. Instead, Hernandez's troops surrounded and seized Osceola, two other prominent chiefs, Coahadjo and Pilot, and 81 of their followers. This capture under a flag of truce was widely condemned throughout the United States. Newspapers criticized Jessup harshly, and many Americans viewed the act as a dishonorable betrayal that stained the Army's reputation. The captured Seminoles, including Osceola, were initially imprisoned at Fort Marion in St. Augustine before being transferred to the more secure Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island, South Carolina, in late 1837. At Fort Moultrie, Osceola, already a figure of considerable renown, attracted many visitors. His dignity in captivity and his fierce reputation drew public attention, and several artists, including George Catlin, painted his portrait. Osceola was ill, suffering from what was likely a combination of chronic malaria, severe tonsillitis, quinsy, and an abscess. Despite medical attention, his condition worsened. On the 30th of January, 1838, Osceola died in his prison cell at Fort Moultrie. His final request, to be returned to Florida for burial, was denied. He was interred with military honors at Fort Moultrie. In a macabre postscript, after his burial, Dr. Frederick Whedon, the attending physician at the fort, secretly removed Osceola's head. Whedon preserved the head, which was later reportedly displayed for a time in a surgical and pathological museum, and then a pharmacy in New York before its whereabouts became obscure. Despite the capture and death of their most iconic war leader, the Seminoles fought on, and the war continued its bloody course far beyond 1840. The U.S. government, desperate to end the costly and increasingly unpopular war, authorized the expenditure of $55, a substantial sum at the time, to bribe Seminole chiefs and warriors to surrender and move west. While some, weary of fighting and facing starvation, accepted the payments and agreed to emigrate, many others refused, choosing to continue their struggle or to retreat deeper into the uncharted wilderness of South Florida. Public dissatisfaction with the war grew, fueled by its immense financial drain and the continuous reports of American casualties with no clear end in sight. By 1841, U.S. Army officials estimated that only about 300 Seminole warriors remained at large in Florida, yet they continued to elude capture and tie down thousands of American troops. The relentless pressure of search-and-destroy missions persisted, gradually pushing the remaining Seminole bands further south into the vast expanse of the Everglades and the Big Cypress Swamp. Some groups were eventually captured. Others, facing dire hunger and exhaustion, surrendered. It was not until 1842 that Colonel William Jenkins Worth, then commanding U.S.S. forces in Florida, concluded that continued military action to forcibly remove every last Seminole would be excessively costly in both lives and resources for diminishing returns. He recommended to Washington that the remaining Seminoles be permitted to stay in an unofficial, undefined reserve in the remote southern swamplands. In the 18th of August 42, the U.S. government quietly declared an end to hostilities, although no formal peace treaty was ever signed with the Seminoles who remained in Florida. The Second Seminole War was a brutal and protracted conflict. Over 40,000 U.S. military personnel, including regulars, volunteers, and militia, served during its 7 years. The financial expenditure reached an estimated $40 million, which, adjusted for inflation, equates to well over $1.5 billion in 2024 U.S. dollars, making it the most expensive of the American Indian Wars. The human cost was also severe. More than 1,500 U.S. soldiers died, many from disease rather than direct combat. Seminole losses, though not precisely documented, are estimated to have been between 3,000 and 5,500 people, including warriors, women, and children, killed in fighting through starvation or disease, or who died during or shortly after removal to the West. The uneasy truce of 1842 did not permanently resolve tensions. Continued encroachment by settlers into areas frequented by the Seminoles led to further conflict, culminating in the Third Seminole War, 1855 to 1858. Yet, despite 3 devastating wars and relentless pressure for removal, a core group of Seminoles successfully resisted and remained in Florida. Their descendants continue to live in Florida today, a sovereign people who persevered through immense hardship and conflict. The struggle for their ancestral lands left an indelible mark on Florida's history. This chapter of American history raises many questions about conflict, treaties, and survival. What aspects of this story do you find most compelling? Join the discussion below.